Thank you. Two things, and I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about it, but I think our friends at the Cato Institute would appreciate this. A job guarantee would eliminate the need for a minimum wage, correct? I mean, a federal minimum wage, it would do away with it because the government is basically setting the base wage, right? I think they would love that. The other thing is, I'm curious, I advocate a universal living wage. It's a wage that is based on, since we have this insane policy of waiting 10, 12 years to increase a minimum wage, there is a theory, a movement that says let's pass a universal living wage. That says, you know what, instead of having to deal with this issue, every 7, 10, 12 years, let's just say we will pass.
A lot of things you can do. You can introduce benefits from the bottom up. You could say 2 weeks vacation, and then private sector would have to have 2 weeks vacation to compete. Okay, you could say childcare. You could put anything in it you want and introduce benefits from the bottom up, right? Healthcare, and so and then competitive market forces would move those benefits up the scale. So what it does is allows us to use competitive market forces to achieve goals. Gives us a tool for that, which is the American approach to things. So it's a hybrid type of approach that gets rid of the moral hazard aspects of other approaches.
In the South African case, we've had a really big debate about, because one of the things I've been doing was designing a minimum wage framework for them, which would embed into the public works program that we've been working on. And over there, of course, you've got the approach that I used to help out that process was to use poverty lines and nutrition rates and things like that. And of course, then you find out that there's objections from the government. Oh yeah, but 30% of private employers are paying well below what you've suggested as your minimum wage. And I said this to the treasurer of the country, that what you've got to decide in any nation is that aims to be a sophisticated, civilised country, is what's the minimum price you want people to be able to do business at. And that minimum price has to be the wage that provides people with an inclusive capacity to interact in society. And if your private sector are paying below that, then you don't want them in your country. That's the reality. Otherwise, you have got no aspirations to be a sophisticated, civilised country. And so the job guarantee wage is, you don't do away with the minimum wage, it becomes the minimum wage. And then you can add on whatever, as Warren says, in political terms, you can add on whatever, in Australia we call them social wage benefits, childcare, and access to all sorts of other benefits that are outside of the direct employment contract. But it is the minimum wage. And you've got to set it at a level that you aspire to be the actual living minimum, not some penurious sort of penalty rate.
Roger Erickson again. Listening to this, I'm reminded of, again, something out in a different field. And the question is about policy. What we've heard described here is options for how we could be doing things differently, but that's not how we can get this group or this population currently in this country to start exploring or selecting other some of these other options. So there's two ways to look at this. One is historically, and we have lots to go on. If you look at small group theory, all these things get worked out through affinity bonds because the group is small enough to everybody's aware of group options as well as individual ones. The problem is scaling up to large populations. The only thing I've learned today about how we've addressed this is when we either have a war or a severe depression. We have to find a mechanism that a population can become self-aware enough to address this kind of what it's leaving on the table, short of having a major depression or a war. And the only example I can think of, the groups that have done this at very large scale are large military groups, and they do what you'd expect from any systems theory. They drive interaction and awareness through absolutely political or operational decisions.
I mean, as Pavlina said, India's got a bigger population than the US, and India has introduced the Rural Job Guarantee as a national employment guarantee. It's employed millions of people already.
We'd love to hear how they did that.
They did it because the growth in the Indian economy, which was urban based in technology and construction.
Just to make it brief, it's not what they did, but how whoever became aware first got the attention of the politicians.
I'm just explaining how they did that. They were faced with, their motivation was they were faced with an urban crisis because the rural poor had no option but to try to flood into the cities to enjoy the growth that was occurring there. And they knew that wasn't sustainable for housing and other reasons. And so they suddenly realised that the reason this migration's occurring is the lack of jobs in the rural sector. Solution, create jobs. Who's going to do it? Private sector isn't going to do it. We've got to do it. And they did it. Millions of jobs have been created in the second largest population in the world.
So the $100 question is, what do we have to do to make our existing Congress aware of things that it's taking years to become aware of?
It's a good question.
Well, that's a serious political question. It's going to take a grassroots effort. It's going to have to come from the grassroots because of, we're talking about, our political system is seriously dysfunctional. To get anything, something like this out of our current political system, it's just unrealistic. So it will be an incredibly difficult endeavor to do something like this. But, it doesn't mean that we don't undertake the effort to do it. And to start advocating this on several means and several levels. The conservatives, right wings have an incredible noise machine that they have used for several decades now, and there's no reason why people on the left don't have to do the same thing, and particularly do it at a grassroots level. We can do it. It's possible. There are certain think tanks out there, progressive think tanks that are hopefully will get on board with something such as this soon, but it's going to take a long time. I probably, I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime.
I disagree, actually. Funnily enough, Warren and I both talked about this. He's been on the campaign trail, so he's had probably more immediate interaction. But whenever I presented this idea, and I presented it at a number of conferences, a lot of speeches, I presented it once when I was in a debate with the former governor of the Bank of Canada, and actually it got a surprising degree of what I would call bipartisan support. I think, as Randy said, a lot of people on the right like the idea that you can legitimize government expenditure via work. And actually, especially when you sell them on the idea that it's not that we want to eliminate welfare, but if you say that it makes welfare redundant because you have this program in place, but it does actually tend to command a lot more appeal. Funnily enough, a lot of times I get I've had objections from the unions rather than on the right, because the unions think that what you're trying to do is create a slave class of laborers that's going to undercut their wages, and you try to explain that you're trying to fill the gap and then create a full employment pool which ultimately enhances their pricing power. So in the first instance, sometimes it can be a little bit deflationary, because if you have someone that's been paid say $40 an hour, and all of a sudden he's lost his job and he has to go to something 8 hours, there is a once-off adjustment. But then the adjustment mechanism the other way is much easier. So I actually think that this is one of our winning ideas, which actually could get a much greater political acceptance than you think.
Yeah, so again, this obviously is coming to a lot of political questions, and I think, a big difference between the United States and basically every other country, especially India, is there's just so much, number one, there's so much noise, and, right, America is like genetically averse to anything that sounds socialist, right? This is a socialist idea, how dare you, right? We believe in private industry, so regardless of the merits of the argument, there's all the noise. But kind of following on what you just said, how do you stop, if this becomes the minimum wage, what stops every minimum wage worker saying, why should I work in private industry? Why don't I just go work for the government? I can't be fired. And effectively, that's kind of the argument probably you'll get from industry is, you're going to compete against private industry, and that's going to drive wages down. Not drive wages down, that's going to support wages, and therefore we're not going to be competitive with government. Where's the argument there?
Look, we're going to have active fiscal policy that keeps, for given size government, keeps taxes low enough so that the private sector will be able to have the means to hire everybody, which means they'll have the means to pay a higher wage. So if we start off at, say, an $8 an hour, first of all, that's not going to be disruptive. I don't think anybody quits their private sector job for that, or very few people. Well, it's full-time work. There's still people who are going to work part-time, babysitting and whatever. So, but you get a few, okay? And then we conduct discretionary fiscal policy so that this pool, the private sector hires these people away. Now, maybe they'll have to pay $10 or $11 or $12. There'll be some spread. But then that spread will stabilize. And then that'll be the stabilized private sector wage, let's say. Unless we overstimulate or we add too much aggregate demand, we allow too much aggregate demand, and then our pool of buffer stock workers shrinks to zero, then of course it's no longer a buffer stock, and then you lose control of prices on the upside, just like with any other buffer stock. But if we conduct policy to keep it at 2-3%, whereas before we had unemployment at 4 or 5%, we've actually reduced the public sector, because the unemployed are in the public sector. Okay, look, the thing is, and don't forget, like when I told you about my cards and creating, okay, if there's a tax to get out of this room, and of whatever, and then I don't offer enough jobs so you can get the money to get out of the room, why did I do it? There's something really wrong with my policy. I should be like lowering the tax or giving you more work, right? I should be increasing my spending or cutting my taxes. So we've got to get discretionary fiscal policy to the point where these people we've taken out of the private sector and not used in the public sector because either we don't want them, we don't want to spend it, whatever, is got to be minimized. Okay, and so we want to minimize it, but we also want to have a buffer stock as a price anchor. Now, every monetary system uses a buffer stock policy. A gold standard is a gold buffer stock. Unemployment is an unemployed buffer stock. What we're saying is an employed buffer stock is far superior to an unemployed buffer stock and far superior to a gold buffer stock. It's larger, deeper, more flexible, and most important, whatever your buffer stock is always fully employed. There's always a bid for the buffer stock. On a gold standard, gold is always fully employed. You can always take an ounce of gold and sell it to the government and get money. You can always monetize it. And a wool buffer stock, where Bill started, there's always a bid for wool. Okay, sheep were fully employed. And so, no, it's true. So right now, we use unemployment as a buffer stock. This is like, clearly shows we don't have any idea what we're doing. Not only do we not understand the monetary system, we don't understand that, well, it's part of it. We don't understand a buffer stock always anchors a monetary system. So we should be using an employed buffer stock.
I get that point. I just think, once again, from someone who said before, I think you kind of assume that everyone does because they don't understand it, as opposed to they do understand, they just don't care, and it serves their interests.
Well, just giving them the benefit of the doubt
Right, yeah.
for rhetorical
You
purposes.
tend to do that a lot.
Privately, I could say a lot of other things if you really want to hear it.
I wanted to correct a misunderstanding, because a lot of people do jump to this, that we're going to guarantee that a job offer for anyone who's ready and willing to work. And then they say, oh, so they'll never get fired. No, we never said that. They don't show up, they show up drunk, they don't do their work, they're fired. Okay? Anything that a private employer can do to legally do to their employees, the employers in this program will do. Okay? And just socialism, I think if you tell most Americans what we're going to do is we're going to require that people who ought to be working, okay, define disabilities, I think very narrowly, they're going to have to work instead of welfare. And you ask them, what would you call that system? All Americans are going to call that, oh, that's capitalism. They wouldn't call it socialism.
Didn't they already say we converted from welfare to workfare? I don't know exactly what that meant, but wasn't that Clinton's big thing?
Well, but without the jobs.
At a minimum, you have to sell your time, and that has value. And look, so we're not talking about the government owning the means of production. We're talking about the government providing for public infrastructure. And public infrastructure is all the things you hire people for, and then you've got this transition pool where you facilitate the transition from back to the private sector, and that's what this does. We're 750,000 in Argentina. I think out of the 2 million in Argentina, 750,000 went to private sector employment within 2 years. People who never would have done this before. Was it more than that? More like half. Okay, that's enormous. These are people who had never been in a private sector, never held a private sector job. The biggest service this did to the economy, well, one was all the direct things, but secondarily, it allowed the economy to expand at very high rates without labor bottlenecks. Okay, so it's an extreme facilitation of private sector, where right now private labor does not flow from unemployment to private sector very well at all. It takes a lot of demand pull to get that done, which is to everyone's disadvantage, to the detriment of all of us.
Just in terms of your concern about the business sector, I've been on about this for 32 years now, since I was undergraduate.
Since the second grade.
Well, as Warren said, I got the idea. I was in my fourth year at Melbourne University, and I was sitting in an agricultural economics class. And at that time, the Australian government was running what was called the wool price stabilisation scheme. And it worked by the federal government. When the private market didn't want to buy as much wool that was put onto the market, the government bought it up and stored it in big sheds. And when the markets were strong, the government wanted to stabilise the price. It just released the wool out of the sheds back into the market. And it was very successful. It provided, it was used to satisfy the rural lobby to stabilise their incomes so they weren't fluctuating. It was very successful. And I remember sitting in this very cold winter day in Melbourne, in Victoria, where I grew up, thinking, well, I didn't really care about, it seemed like a full employment of wool scheme. Every bit of wool that was produced was employed, either in the shed or in the private sector somewhere. And at that time, Australia was just going into very high unemployment it was 1978. And I said, well, I don't really care about wool so much, but I really care about labour, and we could use a buffer stock to do that for workers. But the point about the business is that I often give talks to business community, and they're as right-wing in Australia as they are here. And I've given talks in the Netherlands, they're as right-wing as they are, and in South Africa and elsewhere. And what I say to them, and it's Warren's point, I ask them the question, they're all in suits and what have you, and I say, well, where are the unemployed now? And it's a question they've never really asked, I don't think. And eventually I get them to admit or understand that the unemployed are already in the public sector. Now, you're having debates in Congress somewhere down there or up there, I'm not sure of the direction, about extending unemployment benefits. Well, that's a recognition, and you'll obviously do that again, given the scale of the crisis, I would imagine. But in Australia, we have unemployment benefits guaranteed. But that tells you where the unemployed are. They're in the public sector. So then I say to the assembled businessmen, typically men, I say, well, what are they doing in the public sector? And I can get them to chant nothing. And then I say, well, are you happy about that? And I can get them to say, no, the bastards. And I say, wouldn't you rather them doing something productive in the public sector? And they say yes. And once you go through this logic, you can sneak up on them. And in the end, they become supporters of the job guarantee, doing community-based development work, doing environmental care services, doing aged care services. Because they would rather, their ideology and their prejudices would rather see them doing something than nothing. It's very easy to persuade that.
I would like to echo what Marshall was talking about. It kind of surprised me and woke me up. I have right-wing friends, I'm sure you do too. But there's one thing that does echo with them. Put them to work and they'll pay taxes. And believe me, they agree with me on nothing else. And they think it's a good idea. Believe it or not.
By the way, workfare, the point was raised before, workfare was a state-administered program. And one of the reasons why it didn't work goes back to the old argument: the states don't create currency, so it creates there was an external constraint. But even with that, it did actually reduce the welfare rolls for a time when you had employment being created. But it has to be, it can be administered on the local or state level, but it has to be funded at the federal level. That's a key point.
So I meant to say something about workfare. In Australia, we call it work for the dole. And it's nothing like a job guarantee, because the job guarantee is an unconditional offer. The government sets the price and says we'll take anybody. Workfare and work for the dole are compliance programs to force people to do. It's sort of like Shylock in Merchant of Venice. The government wants you to do something for the pittance of welfare they offer. It's typically not at anything like a living wage. It's a program, not an entitlement. It's usually short-term projects, not doing very much at all. Whereas the job guarantee is an ongoing guarantee. And people say to me, well, what happens if someone liked working in the job guarantee? And I said, well, what's wrong with liking your job? Sounds to me like a good thing if you actually settled in the job guarantee for life and made it a career move. What's wrong with that? Most people won't do that, but some people might. And then it's up to the private sector to restructure their jobs and their wages and conditions offered to make themselves competitive. What's wrong with that? That's going to increase productivity.
Just one final note on the workfare. It was considered a success only because of the reduction in welfare rolls. But when you look at the actual conditions of the recipients, poverty did not change. And in fact, the income that they received was less than if they had remained. The income once they transitioned to jobs was less than what they would have gotten on welfare. So it was considered to be great success during the Clinton Goldilocks years, right? But now it's a whole different ballgame. And you have also these additional issues of if you would like to facilitate this transition from the public into the private sector as well, you also have to provide certain protective services, if you will. You got to provide some sort of transportation, daycare, services that will facilitate this transition into the private sector. So there are things to do.
Yes, I want to ask one not job guarantee related question. I have a friend, Australian economist, and he told me he had to give up on his academic career because he had not mainstream views. So I want to ask, did you have to hide your true views in order to advance in your obviously your professors, you teach students. Did you have initially to hide your true vision in economics in order to get the jobs?
I don't think anyone here did, but we were special cases. Let's say that our goal was to get a position at Harvard. Yes, you absolutely would have to hide this. You'd have to wait till you got tenure, and then you could finally promote this and write the kinds of things the things related to this. But none of us made that choice. So.
Well, we know lots of people who have suffered the slings and arrows of these kinds of things. We've seen university departments, economics departments implode over the differences between those who hold these kinds of views and those who hold the more conventional views. And I think we all know people. Yeah, Notre Dame. Mm-hmm.
The Fighting Irish, literally.
This is more of an idea than a question, but just on the question of how do we kind of implement getting this idea onto the mainstream. I think everyone knows the President's Debt Commission is going on right now. I don't know if everyone knows that since they have no budget, they're actually outsourcing a lot of their roles to the Pete Peterson Foundation, including the listening tour. Is actually going to be the listening tour that America Speaks is putting together that the Pete Peterson Foundation is paying for. The foundation went to America Speaks with the bag of money to do it all themselves. They said they wouldn't do it if it was just the Peterson. So they got MacArthur to lend their name, but it's all Peterson money. We know what Peterson wants to do with it. There are 20 hearings around the country on June 26th. And the thing is, they're all open to the public. So this is the exact type of thing where with a coordinated effort, if we can get people into those meetings and we can raise this, we can at least pull the discussion to a more balanced place than where Pete Peterson wants it, and he paid millions of dollars to make sure that they end up with the recommendations that he wants. So that's, again, it's the organization's America Speaks, and I feel like this is something that this group could maybe do by email and try to get folks into as many of those meetings as possible with this idea offered up as something that the people want.
Any bloggers in here?
I have to sneak in.
One or two. We've got all kinds of bloggers. Not everybody's raising their hand.
Can't hurt.
I don't know. I understand, Randy, and I heard yesterday some things like you're talking about, but I understand that these are very difficult to penetrate, that the groups are pre-screened. It may be even an invitation only, although it will have the appearance of being open to the public and a mix of everyday common Americans. But my impression is that there is a gatekeeper, and it might be pretty difficult to penetrate those meetings.
Just a question. You focused really wholly on the job guarantee with respect to the policy implications or policy considerations. Could you comment some on the healthcare issues and the environmental issues and some of the other policy issues where we're not attempting to meet any of our problems due to budgetary considerations? Those considerations always come in first and seem to control the agenda. They're kind of in the background, but this is off the table and it costs too much, or that's off the table and it costs too much.
I think you just said it all.
I'd
like to hear you say it. I say it all the time, but I don't hear you.
I think, this comes back to what we've been hammering away at all day long, which is that there are all kinds of self-imposed constraints. If you say that you are only going to fund Social Security out of the payroll tax, and you establish these trust funds, and you say the trust fund must have a positive balance, or else we're not going to clear the checks at the level that has been promised, and we're only going to be able to meet 77% or so of promised benefits after some date. I was telling Warren yesterday, I was looking at the trustees report from 2009 for Social Security and Medicare. and what the trustees are projecting for the Old Age Survivors Insurance Trust Fund, OASI, the Disability Insurance Trust Fund, DI, you put them together and you get OASDI, which everybody commonly refers to in everyday language as Social Security Trust Fund. Okay, those are both projected to go bankrupt at some future date. Okay, the 2009 report, the day of doom is now 2037 on those two programs. Health Insurance Trust Fund, the Medicare side, is also projected to blow up, and that's supposed to go bankrupt. The Supplementary Medical Insurance Trust Fund, SMI, is projected to be solvent into the indefinite future. As far as the trustees can see, 75 years and beyond, there is no problem with the SMI Trust Fund, which is Medicare Part D and Medicare Part B. Hey, why is there this difference? Why are the other three going broke, but this one is perfectly fine? And it happens to be that the government has guaranteed to make all payments for Medicare Part D and Medicare Part B out of general revenue and tied the payment of benefits for other Medicare payments, hospital insurance, and Social Security to the availability of the funds in the trust fund. And so, I mean, it's crazy, and it's right there in the trustees' report, and they say it very clearly that the reason that the supplementary medical insurance plan is solvent as far as the eye can see is because the government says so. It's as simple as that.
Just your last question.
With respect to Social Security, so Medicare, is just to have the government say so?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. It's an accounting problem. It's not a financial problem.
So, look, I think we also tend to agree that unemployment is a large cause of the environmental degradation. Nobody cuts their trees down if they don't need the money and they don't need the jobs. And so many of these things that go on are in the name of creating jobs when that shouldn't be the case. We should be at full employment anyway, and then the pressure for all that, I think, would go away.
Here's a snippet of policies that are current, and I won't explain them, but I've written about them and you can read them on my blog. Healthcare. America has a crazy healthcare system. It's a dysfunctional healthcare system, and you could be very well advised to look at the Australian system, universal healthcare. The poorest person in Australia has immediate access to first-class healthcare whenever they want it. And nobody suffers from lack of income in relation to healthcare. So I think universal healthcare is something you should aim for. The government will always be able to afford that if there's enough real healthcare resources available. And if there's not, then you could redeploy people that I'm just about to put out of the jobs in the financial sector as doctors and healthcare professionals. Environment. I've written that, and your government is toying with the same sort of nonsense as my government. Emission trading schemes, market-based trading schemes are ridiculous. You need rules-based schemes. That is, you need to identify, in, say, Australia's case, as the biggest coal exporter. Coal is not a viable long-term industry in environmental terms. Give it 20 years and then close it down. It's a rules-based approach. The sort of emission trading systems that Europe has been implementing are dysfunctional and create a worse problem. Financial sector. We need radical reform of banks. Banks need to go back to being financial intermediaries, not speculators. And I would immediately outlaw almost all over OTC trading and redirect those workers into other jobs that might help us solve cancer and create environmental care solutions and things like that. The only speculation I would allow is that can be readily attached to the real sector. For example, forward markets that provide a counterparty for a manufacturer who wants to hedge exchange rate exposure on some manufacturing contract that crosses borders. That's fine. That's speculation that serves a real purpose. Any speculation that doesn't outlawed, and I would create public sector jobs to provide gambling advice to those that I've outlawed. So there's some policy initiatives. The future to our intergenerational challenge, our dependency ratio challenge, is first-class education at all levels, and public education in my country services by far the greatest majority of people, and I'm not so sure here, but probably at secondary school it still does here. If you, I would have massive injections of public spending into education to increase our productivity. It means that as our dependency ratios will surely rise, we'll be able to get more output per unit of worker and not have to worry about the real resource shortages that might arise. But as we said this morning, the irony is that the solution that we're adopting is to trash our education systems, and therefore we're undermining our future when we think we're actually supporting it. So there's a few snippet of policies.
One more question, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up, at least in terms of the formal ceremonies for the day. Can you pass over the microphone here before we start?
This should be a short question. We've added now 3 countries and examples of social unrest being an impetus for getting policymakers' minds focused on this. We all know a little, I think most of this audience knows a fair amount about different parts of the United States, so at least I'm very curious to know, is there any significant difference in the resistance of people to discussing these ideas in Australia as compared to the United States?
No. With all due respect, the dialogue is more civilised in Australia. The Fox News couldn't exist in Australia. Yeah, the bosses exist. That's why we got rid of him. But the type of journalism wouldn't survive in Australia. We would think it was a joke. Even what I would call the extreme right in Australia is more civilised than Fox News. And I was thinking, we were having a conversation with someone this morning, one of the differences might be that I sense that there's much more of a religious zeal here than there is in Australia. We don't have the fundamental sort of puritanical origins. We were criminals after all. And so I said, and I think you've commented, Randy, when you've come across, when you've been interviewed by our press, that you were surprised by the sort of questions the press and the way in which the public discourse in policy discourse is played out. It's more civilised. But more intelligent, Randy's saying. Well, I wasn't going to sort of say that, mate. But at the end of the day, the neoliberals invaded us too. But our welfare state has been degraded but not destroyed. And I think that they haven't been successful in getting rid of universal health care. They haven't been successful in getting rid of a decent minimum wage system. They haven't been able to completely trash public education. They've tried all of those things. They haven't succeeded in doing that, and they never will. It's too culturally embedded in us. We are a more collective society than the US. We have this concept called mateship, and everybody's a mate. Even your enemy is a mate in Australia. And that's a very strong collective tradition, goes back to the settlement, goes back to our war efforts and our Anzac tradition and all of that stuff. And we at the end of the day, we will not allow a fellow worker to go without healthcare if they haven't got income. We won't allow them to go without housing if they haven't got income. It just wouldn't happen.
If there one last
Yeah, just to follow up on that. All my life I've seen the right-wingers arguing for things that are plainly destructive, and you just said they were trying it in Australia and couldn't succeed. But what are they doing it for? I mean, why do we have so many people trying to do this kind of stuff?
One of the reasons we almost didn't avoid the subprime bubble was because AIG came up to Canada when the Opera government, the Tory government, came into power in 2006, and they argued for us to liberalize our insurance market so they could offer programs like these wonderful credit default swaps. That's what AIG is doing. And the Tories, even though it was a minority government, they were somewhat more ideologically predisposed to doing this than the previous Liberal government were. I mean, it's just, they want to expand their money-making machines all across the world, and it's, it's just, you always want to do that.
So is it just like when you have a 2-year-old who can crawl all over you and do terrible things, but, the reason he does that is because he doesn't know he can hurt you? I mean, are these guys like just children trying to get what they can, do what they want, and not know that it has consequences?
I don't think there's any psychologists on the panel.
No, I think they do it for the funding.
But also, I think...
Funding.
Because it seems to me that it's somewhat for the fun, that to make it more exciting, make life more interesting.
Yeah, but a big part of it is, so you can step back and look at the big picture, but there are, little stories about each one of these. So each individual firm, each individual sector is trying to get a bigger share. And so they're advocating things they see as in their own individual interest. And then we can step back and we say, when we add all these things together, it's a disaster. Okay, I think that's part of it. Now, I do believe in conspiracies, too. But I don't think you have to go there to explain why, if you're Goldman Sachs and you're going to be peddling credit default swaps and betting against your customers, you would like to see that allowed. Okay.
There used to be things you wouldn't do.
Yeah, there was also regulation.
But the other thing is you get a lot of successful people who think it was because of their own doing, and then fund organizations that support self-reliance and all these things we consider right-wing types of things, and less government and that type of thing. And it's not going to stop that. It's just human ego, I think.
Yeah, I think the question about regulation is important. I mean, the big difference in Australia to here in the financial sector is we really kept the regulations on our banks. And not one bank went close to failing in Australia. I mean, we didn't even have a recession because the financial implications were very muted in Australia. And that's because we still maintained most of the regulations. Like, you ditched your 80-20 rule. We didn't have an 80-20 rule. We had a 75-25 rule. We didn't ditch it. The modification we had was that anybody who wanted to go without a 25% deposit had to insure. And the banks had to insure them. And that's a fundamental difference. And the other big difference, of course, was that, and I think you've made this point sometimes too, Warren, is that when did the subprime crisis become a when did we get this sort of debt meltdown? We got it when there was no doubt at the margin people who should never have got loans. But when did the sort of good debt become toxic debt? When people lost their jobs. You could have avoided a whole lot of the bad debt problems if you had have had an earlier and more substantial fiscal intervention. Whereas in Australia, we had a very early fiscal intervention and a relatively large fiscal intervention, and the deficit terrorists were saying, this is ridiculous, what are you doing, you're going to kill us. But it saved us, and it stopped a lot of the good debt becoming bad debt. You didn't do that here. And that's cultural and, intelligence, as Randy says. I didn't say it.
That's what I'm talking about, the reporters.
When you're upside down, the blood goes to your head.
Sorry, I'm afraid we have to stop. It is the time, the witching hour. So I'd like to thank all the panelists who worked so hard on this and who came so far and who've really sacrificed a lot in order to do this today. And I'd like to thank you all for coming, for all the questions and for all the statements. It's really been a very exciting day and a very satisfying day, especially for me.
I think we should get going.